Bill, we talked before about Christian evidences, and so one of the things you brought up was scientific evidence, and more specifically, we're going to talk about medical scientific evidence in this video. So one of the ones that comes to mind is how important blood is to life. Now, that's one of those nah-duh statements. We think that's just taken for granted today as just common accepted medical knowledge, but it always wasn't. I know in the 1700s with George Washington, for example, when he came down with a cold, because it was commonly understood at that time that there were the vapors in the blood were supposedly bad or something like that. They would let blood, hence the name bloodletting, out of the body with like the use of leeches or some other method, and they think that's what contributed to George Washington's death. But yet the Bible, all those many years ago, said that the life was in the blood. Leviticus 17:11 is a great example of this. Now, the context, of course, is talking about animal sacrifice, but one of the reasons why blood is so precious is because one's life is found in the blood. Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. And then, in case there's any misunderstanding, it goes on to interpret that in verse 14, where Moses writes, for it is the life of all flesh, its blood sustains its life. So what's so remarkable about this is Moses wrote this, I want to say around 1450 BC. That's almost 2,000, over 2,000 years before George Washington even existed. And we didn't discover this truth until around 1800s.
Right. Another example is in 1847 in Europe. The doctors would do an autopsy, and then they would turn around and do an examination on a pregnant woman. And the death rate among women that were having babies was at 18%. Well, they figured out that what was happening is they were actually causing it themselves. So they came up with the idea to wash hands with germ-killing agents after they did the autopsies. And once they did that, the death rate dropped from 18%, which is 1 out of 6 women, all the way down to 2%. So the doctors made an amazing discovery about washing hands. Or had they? Moses wrote by inspiration some 3,500 years earlier in Numbers chapter 19 in verses 11 through 13. And this is what he wrote. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd and the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not be clean. So again, 3,500 years ahead of time, Moses wrote through divine inspiration about washing hands with a germ-killing agent after touching a dead body.
It's amazing. And in that same thought, the Bible has a lot to say about sanitation practices. And things we might take for granted for today, just like before. For example, around that same time period, 1846, London had a terrible cholera outbreak because they were just taking their bathroom water and just throwing it out the window. And it was causing terrible sanitation problems throughout the city of London. And cholera was this terrible epidemic. I had to look up what cholera was, but it's this disease where it's a bacterial infection that's caused from contaminated water. It causes diarrhea and dehydration, and many people die of it even today. But yet the Bible says something very interesting. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 23, 12 and 13. Notice what God instructed the Israelites to do through Moses. He says in verse 12, also you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, that when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. And so here God specifically instructed the Israelites how to properly dispose of their refuse. And again, to us, this might just be common sense, but we shouldn't take that for granted because we're only talking as recent as the 1800s.
Right.
So when the Bible uses these, when it speaks about these things, medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, it's always accurate.
Right. Yet another example, the FDA. I'm a restaurant manager, so I'm familiar with the Food and Drug Administration. They make laws governing food handling practices. And just an example, if you go into a restaurant and order a medium rare steak, they'll serve you a medium rare steak. But if you order a medium rare pork chop, they're not going to serve you a medium rare pork chop because pork attracts parasites, and you're more likely to get sick from undercooked pork than you are from undercooked steak. And one of the foodborne illnesses is trichinosis that comes from eating undercooked pork. So regulations are in place to cook pork to a certain temperature. In Leviticus chapter 11, verses 7 through 8, again, Moses, through inspiration, speaks about eating pork. It says, "In the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, it does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you." Another animal that it talks about not eating in Leviticus chapter 11 is bats. Bats are known to cause a foodborne illness if it's not cooked correctly, and people eat them. It's considered a delicacy in some countries, but there are regulations set upon those. Also, lizards, salamanders, amphibians. Those are also in Leviticus chapter 11 talks about not eating those because nowadays we know that those are they cause salmonella poisoning. The Bible never ever gets a medical fact wrong when it's checked out, and that's how we can know that the Bible is of divine origin.
It's amazing. And one thing that I'll add to that before we go is these are many of the things that set the Israelites apart from other nations,
right?
Because they had God's divine will, His revelation.
That's exactly right.